Anastasiya Paraskevova is known as Ukrainian Ana. She is a political activist and blogger who has come to prominence in 2022 after recording her experiences of living in Ukraine during the full-scale Russian invasion. Also, really came to my attention through a fantastic, and I mean absolutely fantastic, performance on the Piers Morgan show, where she hit back at some people who were expressing some extraordinary ignorant point of view, and one of the guests who quite potentially, well, we can't just label him a Russian asset, but he was repeating Russian talking points word for word. Anastasia hit back in an extraordinarily powerful way. Welcome to the channel.
Hello, hello. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with the background because we're having a nice chat before we hit record. But I want to know the background to how you get, to be on what is one of the most sort of prominent media formats. Piers Morgan, love him or hate him, he's a very sort of a divisive kind of figure in that way. I personally loathe him, but that's my opinion. But certainly he's influential and certainly he's extremely well connected both in the UK and the US politically. What was this chain of events that led you to be placed in that audience? And then we will, and on that panel rather, and then we'll come to the experience of being on the panel itself.
Well, it's a pretty funny story that I am friends and also appear on pretty regularly on the streams of a person called Steven Bonnell. He's has a streamer named Destiny, and he has been on Piers Morgan multiple times, mostly talking about American stuff such as elections, Trump, all that sort of thing. And he was one of them anti-Trump people who were invited there and multiple times. And I think I believe so at least, that Piers Morgan's manager person who does casting for, which guests would be on the program. He saw me there, I think, debating someone on his stream. And after that, essentially, they thought, interesting. We could probably invite her on a Ukrainian conversation. So on Destiny's stream, they asked for my number essentially, and he gave the number after asking me if that's okay, and I said, why not? Give my number to them, and yeah. So they messaged me on WhatsApp after that, and we agreed on details. And they were like, "Do you want to appear tomorrow?" And I'm like, "Whoa, no time for me to morally prepare myself. Okay, but I will do it because I thought I have to, because there are no Ukrainian voices presented anywhere. So I couldn't lose that opportunity despite being mighty anxious about it. So, yeah.
And it's a combination of things, isn't it? Yes, you're Ukrainian. Yes, you've got a strong voice, but also being fluent and highly expressive and being able to argue in English, to a very high degree is incredibly important. And I think, a lot of the people I've interviewed on the channel who are Ukrainians, and actually this is the second largest, I think, collection of Ukrainian experts, activists, and voices, my channel, after Ukraine World, which is Volodymyr Ermolenko's channel. It's incredibly important to hear, Ukrainian and Eastern European voices. But when you get someone who's highly expressive and can really argue in both a passionate and an abstract way, that's incredibly important. But then you're also from Kharkiv. How
Mhm.
important is it that you are not just Ukrainian, but someone who is a Russian speaker and really can understand all these points of view and kick back against this argument that, yeah, but, the East is Russian, really, isn't it? And they're
Yeah,
coming in
yeah.
to save you, etc.
Well, it's kind of there is a sort of like a evil satisfaction, I feel. Every time it's rarely that I'm thrusted in that sort of debate sphere, obviously, but when I'm there it's so satisfying because they start on that diatribe about, oh, them Russian speakers, they all even call us Russian sometimes, they want to be part of Russia, it's not as simple as it seems. And now you have me aggressively with my aggressive Russian accent and everything. It's not that aggressive now. It used to be worse before, but it's I'm just like the quintessential like Eastern Russian speaker because I'm like from Kharkiv. Like absolute majority of people before 22 invasion, like I think like 95% people spoke Russian exclusively in Kharkiv. So it's like it's about as Russified as it gets, I suppose you could say, and it's very very. I feel like it has some power to it to be able to they talk about us so much about especially like Eastern Ukrainians, and so much disinformation involves us in particular, and it is especially painful, like you say, to hear all the liberating bullshit because it is us primarily that Russians have been terrorizing and killing. So not that they didn't thrown any bombs at Lviv or like Western Ukraine or Central Ukraine, but majority of damage, everyday bombings are happening in South and East primarily. And
Yeah.
because of that, like you wouldn't find a single person right now, I think, in Kharkiv who hasn't lost at least someone they know, or someone that have been heavily maimed, or they lost at least apartment or like their home, or some sort of situation happened like that. So they have been hurt by the bombing at least somewhat, right?
And this is
Cities are
extraordinary, isn't it?
erased,
I mean,
in Eastern
Dnipro,
Ukraine.
Zaporizhia, Mariupol, uh, these are all were predominantly Russian-speaking areas and
Yeah.
have all been devastated. Kherson, the human safari where Russians, drone units test their skills by killing civilians at random. These are all predominantly Russian-speaking areas bearing the brunt of Russia's aggression.
Yep. Well, it's like sort of like a proximity issue because we're closer to the border. Obviously, we are the front line, and it's much easier. For example, my city was the most damage they did was in 22 with artillery, so they were so close that they nearly took they were nearly they were in the city a couple of of units as well, but they were pushed out of the outskirts of the city, and from the outskirts they just started shelling with artillery endlessly. So the proximity issue obviously matters. After our counteroffensives, effective ones that we liberated Kharkiv region, it got so much better because we pushed them far away and they couldn't get with artillery anymore. They can with glide bombs and missiles, S-300 missiles from Belgorod, it's like that, right? But yeah, it's just first of all it's proximity, and second of all it's it's us they lay claim to mostly. Like, of course, they would take the entire country, I suppose, if they could. But the main interest of theirs is taking the all the regions that are rich in resources that they can also lay the claim to of Russian speakers or like historical context or that sort of thing, which it's false, but they use it obviously because it allows people like Horton on Piers Morgan show to make claims, right, about the Russian speakers and that people really want to be Russian, which isn't it's not there. It's not there in the voting. It's not there in reality. Anyone who has spent here 5 minutes in Kharkiv will tell you that. But yeah, it's a convenient lie that Russia used, by the way, in Georgia as well with Abkhazia, Ossetia, defending Russian speakers, blah blah blah. They use it in Moldova even with Transnistria. So it's just quite a common tactic that many people fall for, unfortunately.
And Hungary has tried that game as well by saying, we're going to come
Yeah.
in and rescue the Carpathians because of all the repressed Hungarian speakers. So this
Oh
is
yeah, the repressed
once,
Hungarians. Yeah, yeah. It's just such a meme. I'm sorry. It's just one of the most funniest thing. We always like joke about it. Like, how about the repressed Hungarians? Though, it's just so funny. If you ever spoke with a repressed Hungarian in the Western Ukraine, it would be difficult because they mostly speak Hungarian. So it's difficult to repress them, but they also know Ukrainian pretty well sometimes. So but quite a lot of them just go around speak Hungarian. Nobody cares. So they're very repressed, very very.
and how odd is it for you? Because you were placed on a panel, you didn't necessarily know what the consistency of the panel was going to be. You got three guests on there plus Piers Morgan. turns out you're in a minority of one. You're the only person who has any local knowledge and context, and at least one of the panel is repeating Russian propaganda narratives word for word, but in a very forceful, I would say rude fashion, over talking, thrusting his point of view forward. How weird is it to hear these classical kind of Russian tropes and even the technique, in Western mouths? Because you mentioned, that phrase, it's not so simple. And это неоднозначно is one of the
Yes,
core principles
exactly.
of Russian propaganda. And then to hear it out
Yeah.
of a Western propagandist, I mean, that must feel quite bizarre.
It is bizarre. I don't know if you know this, but they also sometimes say неоднозначно, but they also say мутно, which is
Well,
murky.
okay.
So yeah, I
Yeah.
sometimes hear that as well repeated. So it's just very it's not as jarring, I suppose, to Westerners because they haven't been growing up listening to Russia, news and Russian. But if you grew up in the sphere of post-Soviet, as they call it, or like at least you have some sort of connection to Russia, then it's incredibly obvious that it's just basically word for word translated in English. First time I was incredibly like shocked when I started interacting, especially with American, media sphere in 22. Before that, I didn't really, I watched movies and stuff, music, maybe games, things like that, but not like in politics of the American people. Didn't really interest me. I just thought Obama was cool, like everyone else. That's about that's about my knowledge that I knew about
They
the
didn't think he was
American
cool on
politics.
ORT and Russia One
Uh,
channel. No,
yeah, I mean, yeah, but it's a very basic kind of like things, like Hollywood actors or some things, but that's about it. But when it comes, my interest really like started in 22 about the what people will they help us or not, what they think about us, all that, and outside of Europe especially, right? And I was shocked with just the amount of the Russian propaganda that was straight from Russia Today, or was like repeating the points that seemed outdated even. So do you know sometimes they say like legitimate president Yanukovych or some things like that. It's just old, like it's 2014. Like nobody talks about Yanukovych now, I think even in Russia. So I don't even see like Russian propagandists talk about Yanukovych, but some people still bring up the coup, the Newland. I didn't even know who that Newland was. I had to research. Why is she so important for my country? Apparently, because of that one phone call when they were discussing, well, who of those like new people will be, our new contact, who shall work with in the future, and people pose that as the proof of Russia, of
yeah.
America doing the coup in Ukraine. It's
But
just,
no
it's
one
just
points
crazy shit.
out that the
Yeah,
people she was pushing, the people she wanted to get into power,
didn't come to
didn't
power.
actually get
Yeah,
into power. But also,
yeah, that's
she handed out some
true.
cookies on Maidan as well. So there's the cookies. Don't forget
Yes,
the
the
cookies, right? That
cookie.
made all the
The
difference.
Yes, but unfortunately, like I said on Pierce, I didn't get any. So how what do people say when people don't get awards? Snub, I think, or
Snob, you're
something. This is the
a
word.
cookie
Yeah,
snob.
I was
Yeah,
snubbed. I didn't get any cookies. Other people supposedly did, and I didn't. Very upsetting, honestly. I think I deserved a couple
I
at least.
I think you should go
Um,
on in a Maidan Square now with a placard going like, "I want my cookies."
yes, where are they? I deserve them. I was there every day, pretty much. Yeah, so anyhow, point is that yeah, that's what that was difficult to understand and to even deal with, because it's just one thing to hear that from Russia, and it's a completely different thing to hear it from the West, who you expect to be better, I guess, when it comes to Russian, not repeating straight up like Kremlin's bullshit. But it's not the case, unfortunately, especially I'm sad to say in the United States. It seems to be very prominent in like circles of especially like populists, isolationists, whether they are left or they're right. Sometimes doesn't even you can't even tell sometimes the difference between like left populists and right wingers in that sense when it comes to like international approach to international politics, or Ukraine, or even like other places as well. So it's just you know
And
not good.
there's a commonality as well, isn't there? Which is a sense of almost sort of loathing or of their own country. You know, they'll
Mm,
be saying, right, we should have nothing to do with this because, our country is wrong. Our country is, going back to Trump's speech, American carnage. You talk your own country down, you talk down its values, or you say it's betrayed its values, and there's this extraordinary negativity, and this historically has been very prevalent in the left and talk about, the imperial legacy, which isn't to say there isn't a
mhm,
lot to talk about. There isn't a lot to
mhm,
deal
mhm.
with, which of course there is, but it gets translated into this kind of self-loathing and this, rip it all down, none of it's any good kind of attitude. That form of nihilism is very common in Russia, and it's a key part, I think, of the Russian mindset, but a key part of the propaganda as well. It's nihilistic at its
100%,
heart.
yeah. Mhm. Yeah, I also noticed that something actually brought exactly nihilism to my friend who Destiny on stream, because I sensed that sort of thing. It's not identical, obviously, to Russian version because they're completely different, like history and culture and everything, quite different. But one of the core issues that people really seem to not like understand about Russia is that it's not just like, oh, like, hey, the Ukrainians, let's kill them all. Obviously, like every single person doesn't think that way. What is the most prominent thing is exactly what you brought up, is the nihilism, and the fact that people, they really don't believe they can change anything. They think the system is shit and there's nothing you can do. And in Russia, they are more correct than they are in America, obviously. So in that sense, I'm not like excusing their indifference or their conformism. It's not an excuse for that, but it's at least like makes some sort of sense because of the authoritarian structure of Russia and mafia state essentially that people have there.
Mm.
But when it comes to that, it's that sort of like everything is lies, everything, nobody says the truth, everything is equal. Like no political parties have any differences between them. All of them are evil and lying, all that. And you can really see that being pushed in America, both very left leaning people, but exceptionally strong now, I think, in MAGA circles. The media is, it lies, everything is lies, everything is fake news. It's just destroying the truth itself and the people's belief that such a thing as even truth exists anymore. So, and you undermine institutions like crazy. So that's also something, unfortunately, both leftoids and rightoids in the American politics seem to be very interested in doing. So that has bad consequences. Bad consequences, especially now, as any Eastern European watching American stuff right now is like, what the hell? Looks a lot like what happened to us back in the day. The oligarchy on the rise, like Elon Musk that are, aiming to be godkins. It seems like ruling every single thing. The richest man alive, so close to Trump and so influential in his decisions. It's just pretty, like, you can even see the picks Trump recently appointed or is supposed to appoint. I suppose not of them, not all of them have been like confirmed, but it's just the oligarchy bros. And it's very Russian, I must say. Never thought I say this phrase about America, but it is what it is. It's recognizable to
Mm.
us as people have been dealing with like corruption and oligarchy for a very very long time.
And if we look at that in the Ukrainian lens, as an activist and someone who is seeking to go from a country that had potentially low trust, and we know the lowest trust is in Russia, and the state actively worked to break bonds of trust apart. In Ukraine, coming out of the Soviet experience, moving into oligarchy, trust is a difficult thing to establish, and it seems to me at least that the experience of people on Maidan is incredibly pivotal. Going through multiple revolutions, it builds trust from the ground up because people are there, they have different political points of view, different conceptions of society, but they're there, they're physically meeting, they're understanding that the political point of view doesn't define the entirety of a person, and then you're able to take those bonds of trust forward. Now, it's not an absolute, but it does seem to at least help. What you said there is interesting because it suggests that when you have an authoritarian slide, when you have a slide to autocracy, the first thing you need to do is to start breaking apart those bonds and trust. And you've mentioned there two things. You start with the legacy media and you start with institutions. But ultimately, you end up in breaking up the bonds of trust between individuals and communities as well. Do you see that
100%,
process
yeah.
very clearly?
Yeah, that's 100% true, because it starts off with this like up, thing. So like I said, media, politicians, things like that, and then it kind of like crumbles down to just individual people. It fosters like a lot of distrust, and also I don't know if you know this phrase, but it's something you learn in Russian sphere, and it's человек человеку волк, which is a man to a man and is a wolf, I guess you could say. And it's just something that it's actually a phrase people teach their children in Russia as well. I learned it as a kid as well, because it just showcases how little trust you should
Yeah.
show to other people. So only people you can sort of trust are your like closest like family members, maybe like people in your closest circle. But the rest of the people are like wolves, and you shouldn't
Yeah.
let your guard down
Well, the other one
with
is
them.
Volkami Zhits
Yeah.
Povolchivit, I think is the other
Yeah,
one.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes, welcome жить по волчью. Yeah, that's also another one. So, but it's like basically shows you that if you have to be like a wolf yourself as well. So and there's like I don't know if you can swear here or not, but there's another phrase. If how to say this without swear word? Quite difficult in Russian, if I'm honest. Let me think for a second. But basically, if you don't screw, or I figured it out without the F word. If you don't screw people over, you will not be able to live, essentially.
Yes.
So
I got a
this is
cleaner
also like a
version of
phrase.
that. I learnt one
Oh,
of these phrases which just I didn't understand it at first. It had to be explained to me, but when I understood it, I found it to be very compelling. And that was like I'd come back from the market and I'd bought some stuff, meat to make shashliki or something like that,
mhm.
And I was hoping that people would be impressed because I'd got a reasonable price and it was a good cut. And my mother-in-law just came out with the phrase. Деньгами и дорог купить. Which is like, even
Yeah. Yeah,
I got to explain
that's
for the
yeah,
English,
just
like even an idiot can get something with money, But the implication
yes,
is that
yes.
a smart person
Oh, you do
steals.
know Russia. I'm
Yeah,
impressed. Yes, you do know what's up. So I'm joking. Obviously, you do. You have been there, but I just mean yeah, it's just that sort of mentality is many people really don't know, like that haven't been in there and don't know, and it's a very destructive mentality when it comes to a cohesive society, when it comes to people having like a social, connections when they come to them, supporting liberty of each other, people's rights. It's just you won't do it because why would you, right? In a system like that, and that's something that we really escaped. Thankfully, that sort of mentality in my opinion, in 2014. So when the Maidan Revolution happened, it was impossible not to trust people because they really basically defended your back, right? So you trusted random people I never like met before to protect me, right? And to help us stand. And how many times I was picked up when I fell like on ice or something like by other people, right? It just teaches you a completely different worldview. And I really felt like insanely connected and loved, and just felt like a nation in the best sense of the word. It's not in a like a aggressive expansionist like nationalism kind of way, but in like a civic. We are all together in this, no matter what we are, sort of nationalism, right? So there were like Armenian people, Greek people, Russians, Ukrainians, like all sorts of people, right? One of the first people who was killed was like a Armenian Ukrainian guy, right? And there was like this sense of like unity that didn't involve like ethnicity. There were like right wing people, more of central sort of people, even like some lefties, which are extremely rare in Ukraine due to the communist, history and everything. But still, there are like some sort of collection of people. Some people wanted to be part of European Union. Some really didn't, but they didn't like that people got beaten up by the government for protesting. Some people were like, oh, we really should be like on our own. Some people were like, well, we shouldn't really be friends with Russia at all because they subjugate us and things like that. And some people were like, oh no, we should probably still maintain connections back in the day with Russia. It was like a collection of very different people who even saw future of the country quite differently sometimes. But the main idea was that we cannot allow our government to do what they did. And we cannot allow them to make us into like a Belarus sort of state with dictator laws that Yanukovych tried to pass, with that people will not be allowed together, essentially not allowed to protest whatsoever, right? So we all had this sense that it's going somewhere we don't want it to go. and we need to stop it now, otherwise we won't be able to have a future that we think we should have. So yeah, that was pretty magical, I'd say.
And there's two areas I wanted to cover in the time we got left. I mean, one is to lead onto that, and another territory which you have a connection with, and that's Georgia. We see the same mechanisms, the same toolkit of authoritarianism being rolled out in Georgia. It's now possible to compare the different methodology used, and actually there's a lot of commonality between what happened in
Mhm.
Belarus, what Yanukovych tried to achieve, and what they're now doing in Georgia. And of course, the methods changed ever so slightly. You know, George and Dream have spent much longer pretending to be one thing before the
Mhm.
mask is ripped off. So they've perhaps learned a little bit from the success in Belarus in repressing the protesters. They've learned a little bit from the failure of repressing Ukraine through Maidan and through coercing its institutions, penetrating its military, penetrating its administrative class and military class with an intelligence community with Russian assets and agents. They kind of learnt from these failures, and now they're having a go in Georgia. But you have connections there. So do you see this sort of commonality between the protesters in Maidan and in Georgia now, and a commonality within the techniques that are being used by the regime and the propagandists?
Yeah, definitely. Like most people in Georgia seem to be, well, quite literally want the exact same thing that we wanted. So there is not like a big difference there. Most people, want to be in European Union in Georgia. Many people want to step away as far as possible from Russian. My Georgian friend actually said this, but so now I'm stealing this phrase and using it everywhere. But they don't want to be a playground for Russian oligarchs, is what he said. And that I think describes the absolute state of Ukraine before 2014 as well, because we were a playground for Russian oligarchs. So like every major industry, every factory, every business was owned by Russians, by Russian citizens or dual citizens, right? You couldn't do anything without Russians saying so, okay in that, right? I saying yes to it, right? So that's something that almost everyone, when people speak about like, oh, Eastern Europeans are so corrupt. Well, true, but partially because everything is owned by Russian oligarchs that have no interest in improving those countries, only in stealing resources from them, right? So nobody wants to be that, obviously, right? And unfortunately, we are also hostages of Russia, because as soon as we try to escape this mold, right? As soon as we try to escape this set of rules that they enforced upon us, we have to, pay for it. First in blackmail, they will like say we will cut like you economically, right? You will damage you like in the trade and everything, right? And then if that doesn't work, then they will say, oh, we'll took a chunk or two, annex a thing or two from you. And then if that doesn't work, well, you now see what's happening in Ukraine, right? So that's unfortunately is how they dealt with like almost anyone, right, at this point. So Georgia is a very small country. Obviously, it's not Ukrainian size. It's like 2 million something population, but or 4 million. I'm not sure. 2 million. I think it's Moldova. Like, but
I think
whatever.
it
It's
is. I
small.
think
It's
somewhere
small.
around there, 3, 4 million is the figure I got in
Yeah,
my
it's
head,
a
but I need
small,
to
it's a
check.
small
Yeah.
little thingy, right? So because of that, of course, it's quite difficult for them, because if Russia attacked them, for example, well, they are in much more tougher situation. Even we are 30 times less in size than Russia, so that's already something. But they want the same thing essentially. Like they want human rights, they want liberation, they want normal laws, they want less corruption, they want working institutions, and they want trade partners that will not coerce them, blackmail them, and attack them militarily. Not a huge thing to want, honestly, in 21st century. But yeah, but then comes the methods of the Russian dream, so to speak. They are quite similar to, they use titushki, which is like a thug, paid thugs, like pretty marginalized people who you can pay money to, and they will do pretty much any criminal act against the protesters or activists or people like that, getting beaten up, caught on the streets somewhere when going home, and getting their shit beat out of them. So that is the same methods using like special forces. They have now their sort of like their own Berkut, I suppose you could say, their own version of that is also beating the protesters up. All that attempts to crack down on protests, even water cannons are there, all the classics. So so it's very unpleasant to get splashed by that thing. So point is that gas, tear gas, things like that, right? All of that also deeply unpleasant. And yeah, so they are using the exact same methods, just like you said, pointed out very correctly, that they kind of pretended to be not as obviously a pro-Russian party for some time, and they didn't, and they tried to push back towards Russia and away from European Union in much more gentle, long and like measured way than Yanukovych tried to just do a 180, as some people say, like to do this like sort of turn that annoyed the hell, okay, out of people, annoyed the hell out of people pretty heavily, and it inspired the protest, right, of just students. And then he decided, we can like just beat those students up to a pulp and it will be all over. And that annoyed millions of people. So first he annoyed thousands of people, then he annoyed millions of people, right? So that is not good. Didn't work that good for him, right? And yeah, I think Georgia Dream is learned from that and tried to do it in a much more, maybe even Russia learned from that actually, and told them that you probably shouldn't be as obvious and as on the nose about it. So
Yeah, if they bring in
I don't know.
snipers, if they start shooting protesters, that would
Yeah.
trigger an even bigger wave. But as it is, it's on a knife edge. It's not clear. I
Yeah,
mean,
they're like,
speaking, yeah,
mhm,
I mean,
yet
people
here and
leave.
there.
If it gets worse, a lot of the people who've protested, like in Russia, they'll be on CCTV. They'll be able to, maybe it's not as sophisticated as the systems they've got in Moscow, but they'll be able to track people down, their places of work. They'll be able to coerce those employers, whether they're private or state. So you can see how that authoritarian slide, where that will go if the regime succeeds. So we got that template. The last area to talk about, and this is painful and tricky because this relates back to a lot of the conversations happening now about freezing the conflict, negotiations, and blah blah blah.
Hmm.
I don't think when you talk about whether a treaty with Russia is worth the paper it's written on, of course it's not. If it's not backed up by force, it has no legitimacy in the eyes of Russia. We don't even need to probably debate that. I think we understand that intrinsically.
Yep.
But there is still, it seems, amongst many in the West, the idea that ceding these territories to Russia, at least temporarily, or accepting they're going to be de facto under Russian control, is not such a bad thing. That ignores or even presumes that the people living there will be kind of okay with that. But this is very different from the lived experience of being under Russian occupation, isn't it? It could be
Hmm.
described as a modern gulag. It could be described as a living hell. I'm not sure those people who talk about negotiating with Putin really think about these things enough, or think about the children who've been abducted, and it will be very difficult to get them home in a frozen conflict.
It's quite difficult to get them now. Never mind if it gets frozen. So yeah, you're completely like correct. It actually kind of happy to even hear this because so many people really, first of all, it's underreported. That's a problem. So many people actually don't know just how hellish the occupation by Russia is. So I wouldn't blame people like fully for that because literally the only legacy media I saw reporting on the, maybe it changed, but the last time I checked, it was Financial Times who reported on human safari drone attacks in Kherson, right? So that's it. They have been happening since early September, I believe. And by now we have like hours of footage that Russians themselves filmed of doing it. So it's not discussed anywhere near as much as some other things are discussed, not to point fingers, right? But about targeting civilians, that is very obvious, right? And filmed by the perpetrator even themselves, right? Here are all the proofs you need. They filmed them, but still people don't really talk about it that much. And I think that's a big problem about, for example, Izium, which is in my Kharkiv region, has the biggest mass grave since Yugoslavia genocide, and it has not been reported that much by anyone. So I personally saw people being pulled out of those mass graves with their genitals cut off. And where's the coverage? Where's the coverage of that? Right? Not much. Bucha got some coverage, yeah, but Izum didn't get nearly as much, and it was worse than what we discovered in Bucha. So yes, people really don't think about that. Or they either don't know or they simply don't care. and many people just think that they kind of like on subconscious level think that there's no difference, I guess, between us. And some people will be just cool with having another flag on top of them. Sometimes I hear like it's very ridiculous, but I hear Westerners speak that way, like as if it's just, it's Ukrainian flag or it's like a Russian flag, and that's about it, right? So that's all the difference there is to it, right? Of course, people wouldn't want to die for that. Like, why would you want to fight in a war and getting shelled if you can just live under another flag? It's all Gucci, right? And it's absolutely ridiculous. And it also shows, I don't want to, this is an overused word, but that's privilege speak. So that's only something you can say if your nation have never been invaded by a forceful another nation that is much more like bigger, powerful than you are, and you never lived under occupation, and you never know what it's like to live under the
Mm.
occupation of people who hate you, who despise your nation. So that's really, it's a completely different, and I understand that because most of my good Western friends who even like, understand many things, they truly never been through that. So even generations of their, parents have never been through that, and
But
their
some of
and
them
their
will
grandfather.
understand it. This is what I
Yeah,
don't quite get. Some will
yeah,
understand it if you translate it very slowly into their context. Like, imagine an English flag being hoisted over Dublin and all the
yeah.
Irish
I
tricolors being
that
taken.
example.
Imagine the,
Yeah.
flag of St Andrews in Scotland being
Mhm.
taken down and burnt, and the English flag hoisted in its return. You put it in those terms, they're like, ah, I get it.
Suddenly
I
the flags matter, actually.
Suddenly flags matter, and suddenly
Yeah,
they
yeah.
like, oh, hang on a second. Yeah, we understand English imperialism and how that's worked out over
Mm.
centuries. Um, One has to say that that is even in some ways an even more complex story than living under Russia because yeah, there's been erasure of languages, there's been a erasure of communities, but it's not as genocidal in various points
Yeah.
as the Russian is less efficient, more brutish in
Mhm.
its conquest than even the English have been at various points in history, even the lowest points in history. But that's
Mm.
another story. It must be endlessly frustrating for you trying to convey this, and especially
Yes.
now when negotiations are so much talked about.
You won't even believe it, I think, if I tell you, but I actually spoke with an Irish guy who was making like pro-Russian points. And he was speaking in English with me, and he brought up the argument that it's because we speak Russian have some sort of claim. And I'm like, bro, like, are you serious right now? And when I asked him, like, so England should invade like your country right now and take all of it, and he was like, what? No. And I'm like, why are you serious? You're bringing up the exact same, like word for word tradition. It's like a mirror of each other, essentially. This the Russification, Anglification is not a word, but you understand what I mean. Like destroying of the local language and making people speak that language as a tool of influence, essentially, right? And he was like, he was scratching his head afterwards, and I was like, how did you? He wasn't clinically stupid, okay? So I'm confused, like how people do not get that. Maybe because they just grew up in such a he's lefty, but so he grew up in such a like a um understanding that only Western imperialism exists and no other sort of like colonialism or imperialism exists. And sometimes their eyes go like all bugged when you call Russians settlers, for example. But what else are they? They
Colonists,
quite
yeah,
literally are
absolutely, yeah.
doing that. Yeah, so they killed people in Mariupol. They chased most of them out, and they now occupy their houses. They did the same in Crimea with both Ukrainians now and Crimean Tatars. More importantly, when they removed the entire population from there of native people, and then brought Russians there and settled them there, right?
And in fact,
So
they did
it's
it
just
every corner of their empire. I mean, I remember being
yes, they
in
did it everywhere.
Karelia, and it's bizarre
Yeah.
being in a territory which, within living memory, within the memory of, say, your grandparents or even parents, a territory would have belonged to a different country, and all the people living in the towns and the villages would have been different, and you could see it, in the culture of the town. I went to there's my brain's going to fail me, and I'm going to forget the name. Viborg, it's called. It was the
Ah,
third
Viborg, yeah.
largest city in or Viipuri in the Finnish, third largest city. Um, and under the Soviets, when it was occupied by the Soviet Union and Russia, it turned from being a cosmopolitan, vibrant city into basically nothing more than a village. That was the sense that I got when I was there, and it's like
A
this is
bit of a
very
shithole now,
difficult.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, that's the problem, that they, they kind of like, it's either ours on or it's nobody's, it's kind of like their motivation there, so they would rather ruin a thing than not have it. So that's kind of like the strategy they used, for example, with cities like Mariupol, which was a thriving, big, very quite beautiful, prosperous city by Ukrainian standard, I guess you could say, uh, but by many standards actually, it was quite good. And yeah, and what do we have now of it now is it's a complete it's just they just in my city alone there's like this big area, used to be, that is called Pivnichna Saltivka in Ukrainian, and it's like a big residential area essentially where 500,000 people lived. So most residents of Kharkiv actually lived in this area alone, and it was completely ruined. There's like almost nothing left of it. And it was destroyed by artillery primarily in 22, back in 22 before counteroffensives. And it's just ruinage. It's just straight up ruinage. And yeah, and people just like I said, people seem to have either no knowledge of it, whether it's educational problem, I don't know, maybe in your sort of like schools and things like that, there has to be some sort of, I don't know, change. It's cool that you talk about like Western imperialism and colonialism. You contemplate that. Very few people today I hear from like British people,
I,
example, or like Americans be saying, "Hey, yeah, we killed those Native Americans, cool,
yeah,
right?"
yeah,
Most people wouldn't say that, obviously, in America, and that's great. Russia doesn't do that. They don't
no.
contemplate their like their genocides, their failures, their war crimes, anything. But also maybe think about that you're not the only one who ever did that. Just something to think about for the Western
It's a
audience, I guess.
human process, right? We're not the inventors of it. I mean, that itself is an
Yeah.
imperial idea, isn't it? That only we can be
Mm-hmm.
imperialists. I mean, that's
Oh
very
yeah.
imperial in its own right. Right.
Yeah.
We could probably talk for many hours, and we're going to get comments, and I always do. The trolls, especially the Russian-oriented trolls, love to say, "What is a British guy talking about imperialism?" But again, it's like my ancestors are from Ireland. So, yeah, there is some experience there. They're from Southern Ireland and they've got direct experience of that. The other side of the family fled the Nazis in Central Europe. So, again, a collapsing empire, the Habsburg Empire, there's experience of that and the toxicity that comes out of a collapsing empire. So, yeah, I think it's important to examine that and talk about it. And I went to university in Scotland. So again, I got kind of some sense of what other people's point of view might actually be. I'd love to have you back on the channel. I think we could probably talk for many, many hours about this.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Sometime I would love to actually, to come along again if you will help me.
I would absolutely be delighted to. I think it would be, there's so many other sort of topics we could dive into. I think it's important as this conversation about negotiations evolves and develops in the new
Oh yeah.
year. Let's
Mm.
examine that and, at all costs avoiding a Minsk 3 and the sort of weaknesses of that.
Ooh,
Oh God,
we
that's
shall
another can
see
of worms. Yeah.
what Mr. Trump will do. Nobody knows.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just pretty anxious time for us, I suppose. We shall see how it plays.
Well, for now,
Yeah.
Anastasia, your work is fantastic. Your voice is an incredibly strong and passionate one for Ukraine. I'm delighted to be able to, for those in the audience who are familiar with you, it's great. For those who are not, I'm actually delighted to be able to sort of introduce your work to them and your face and your voice as well. And yeah, let's talk again in the new year.
Thank you for having me on. Well, yeah.